Welcome to MOT In Conversation with composer Nkeiru Okoye and opera administrator and dramaturg Lee Bynum. A roundtable on the future of representing Blackness and Black stories in opera. Our goal is for audiences to understand the current relationship and possible future between Black culture and opera, and how opera creators and producers are engaged in furthering that relationship. Hailed as sublime by the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Dr. Nkeiru Okoye's genre-bending compositions in both the opera theater and symphonic mediums reflect a dizzying range of influences. A musical storyteller, researcher, and historian, Okoye's best-known works incorporate social science themes while combining a wealth of influences and styles. Her music freely navigates between African American improvisatory and folk idioms and contemporary concert practices. Okoye is best known for her opera Harriet Tubman, When I Cross That Line to Freedom, and her 9/11 inspired orchestral work, Voices Shouting Out. In March 2020, the state of Michigan issued a proclamation acknowledging her extraordinary contributions to the history of Detroit for Black Bottom, a symphonic experience commissioned by the Detroit Symphony Orchestra in celebration of the centennial season of Orchestra Hall and Detroit history. Among Dr. Okoye's upcoming projects are a triptych of sung stories, Tales from the Briar Patch, commissions from Baldwin Wallace Conservatory and on-site opera, and an untitled Gathering for Voices, Choir, and Orchestra commissioned by University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Dr. Okoye holds a BM in composition from the Oberlin Conservatory of Music and a PhD in music theory and composition from Rutgers University. Minnesota Opera's new Vice President of Impact, Lee Bynum, served previously as Senior Program Associate and Associate Director of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. His work has been focused largely on anti-oppression and anti-racism and leading cultural organizations to integrate how they can better foster equity, diversity, and inclusion. Before joining the foundation, he served as the assistant director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University, where he was responsible for the administration of the Latinx, Asian American, Native American, and Comparative Ethnic Studies program. As a dramaturg, he has collaborated on the development of new works with American Opera Projects, the John Duffy Institute for New Opera, and Columbia University. His historical research on race and ethnicity in classical music, concert, dance, and theater has been widely published, and he received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Columbia University.
Thank you so much, Nkeiru Okoye and Lee Bynum, for joining us today for this conversation talking about the future of representing Blackness and Black stories and culture in opera. My first question I will turn to Nkeiru. Why opera? Describe for us why and how opera has become your choice medium.
Well, I'm glad you asked. I started as an instrumental writer, and I actually had no interest in opera whatsoever. And then I wrote one. Oh, you learn so much when you're writing an opera. You learn about their storytelling. There is, in this case, it was Harriet Tubman, so it's a historical figure. But the piece started out because I was an orchestral writer, and I was at a school that had this enormous Black choir, and they read music. It was a famous choir. So, of course, the thought was, you're going to write music for the choir. Well, I didn't know how to write music for the choir. I mean, it sounds simple enough, but this is a famous choir. So, the stakes are just exponentially higher. So, I wrote a couple of things, and then I had this idea, okay, I'm going to write something that's epic. It's going to be about a Black woman. And for whatever reason, I was in Maryland. And so Harriet Tubman, because she came from Maryland, was just that natural solution for that. And I thought, well, I'm going to write this oratorio and it's going to have a lot of spirituals and it's going to have some Tubman quotes. And someone did the same piece. They had done it already for Martin Luther King Jr. And at that point, Tubman had already become this kind of larger than life figure. You know, she was kind of conducting me. She was like, Nkeiru, you're going to write an opera. And so that's what I did.
Very good. How about Lee? Tell us about this medium. How did you choose opera? Did you grow up listening to the Metropolitan Opera broadcast on Saturday, or how did you come to this?
On PBS, actually. I grew up in classical music from the age of 8 through my 20s. I sang, I composed, I studied dance, and I played a couple of instruments. And for the decade after college, I ran a New York City nonprofit theater company that I co-founded. And I felt for most of my life as if I were in love with the group of art forms that just didn't love me back. It was actually, though, running my theater company that I had my first foray into what commissions, community programming, and casting practices could do in terms of promoting a progressive, demographically informed set of changes in the performing arts. So subsequently, I went to pursue a PhD in educational history, and I spent grad school examining how African Americans and Indigenous Americans and disabled Americans were trained at conservatories. And what animates my interest in this work is this idea that we belong in this space too. And that's primarily the thing that brought me to Minnesota Opera. In the US, the storytelling potential of classical music has really not been harnessed to its fullest communicative potential. And this is less about a radical redefinition of classical music than it is about creating a set of access points that allow for solutions to the practical and conceptual challenges that keeps a lot of us from experiencing opera, not enjoying it, but actually experiencing it, right? The form itself is fine. It's the content and delivery that seem to need a bit of reframing for contemporary American audiences. And I think right now the field is really poised to have a set of conversations around acknowledging and owning and remedying this painful history of discrimination. And that's really what I'm invested in.
We're going to come back to that subject. I want to ask another issue about picking subjects. Nkeiru, when you're writing a new opera about African-American subjects or people, describe for us, what's the process? How do you identify subjects and develop their operatic qualities?
Let's take Harriet Tubman, for instance. Harriet Tubman has a couple of different operas. She's just that type of woman. And my take on this story was to look at what's the most common denominator here, what resonates most on a human level. And with Harriet Tubman, I wanted to know why. Why did she go up and down the Northeast Corridor? We know that she went up and down the Northeast Corridor, but realistically, that's a very bad story. You know, I mean, let's, here's attempt 1, here's attempt 2. Why is so much more important. And as I, found out why, I was like, oh, it's to get her sister out. That's a good story. That's operatic. And then I made everything from the context of this love story between Harriet and her sister Rachel. And that, people identify with trying to keep a family together. They identify with sisterhood. They identify with wanting to care for a sick child. And also, there's sibling rivalry. There's, this person left, and when this person comes back, they're larger than life. And so these are things that transcend race, gender, or anything else. It's just a good story. So that's what I look for.
Got you. Can I ask this question? Because I love Harriet Tubman. When I look at like your voices shouting, something you wrote after the 9/11 attacks, or
Shouting out?
I'm sorry?
You mean voices shouting out?
Yes. I'm
Mhm.
sorry. Did I say voices?
You said voices shouting.
I'm sorry. Yes, that's what I meant. And, or for example, or even the invitation to a die-in after
Yeah.
Trayvon Martin. That's, how do you see that? Then do you see that those are, I guess, were reactions to what was happening in real time in our society, a reply or a response to what's going on in our society now, as opposed to maybe in Harriet, where you maybe just thought about maybe this is a subject that should be looked at because it was raped.
Well, just to be clear, Harriet had a context, and the context was your employer asks you to do something. So that that can be a stimulus, but in very real world. Oh, now, with invitation to a die-in, because that is operatic. It's also, it's theatrical, but it's also a bit of performance art. You know, I had this really awful, traumatic, racist event that happened in my life. And it made me extremely vulnerable, and it made me aware that regardless of my degrees, regardless of my status, what it is that I was doing, in the end, these folks saw Black person X, and they treated me accordingly. And that oh gosh, that was one of the only times I've actually seen my mother cry in terms of, oh my goodness, I cannot believe this happened to this child that I raised. Invitation is it's angry, it's shockingly angry. It involves everybody, and my thought is it's not just about one person, it's about everybody. This thing that happened to me, these things that happened to Black women, these things that happen to Black men, the whole reason why we have Black Lives Matter the first time, and then why it had to come back, is because people don't value African American life. And when we say that, I really, really mean that anytime you call someone other, anytime the title rather than man is Black man, anytime that rather than composer, it's Black composer, or now BIPOC composer, you are dehumanizing us. And once you do that, it's already started. And so invitation takes all of that and kind of explodes on the stage. And I have to say, when I saw it, and should I tell everyone what invitation is?
Oh, please, please, please.
All right, so invitation to a die-in, we called it a monodrama for African American baritone and orchestra. But the fact that it is casted specifically for an African American baritone, it takes it out of monodrama and puts it into theater. And it calls upon specific performance practices. So we weren't quite sure what to call it, and maybe it doesn't need it, but it's the story of this deceased Black man who has an encounter with a police officer. And when you see it, it's heartbreaking. It makes you angry. It's heartbreaking. And for me, this character, the Black man who did the premiere performance, he was John Tubman in Harriet Tubman. And I'd always seen him as this larger than life figure. And I have to tell you, when I see this happening to him, it made it much more personal, and it was just all the more devastating. So I had a reaction to it, which, usually, you get away with, okay, I'm gonna do the academic thing. I'm gonna be detached. Here's my detachment. And I could not do that with that piece. So it's tremendous.
I was going to say, Lee, I know you've had some experience in the past. You had some training as a composer, but more recently you've been working on the administrative side, education, and of course as a dramaturg. How about yourself when picking a piece that would resonate with people of today? What do you have a process that you use when picking pieces?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think the thing that is most of interest to me is making space for today's storytellers to be able to tell their own truths. And from an institutional standpoint, some of this is really about thinking through how do we share resources? And then some of it's also about thinking about what does it mean to provide a platform? But there's also another piece, right? And that's really identifying the people who have a message to convey that suits the demands of the operatic medium. So sometimes coming from this from an educator's point of view, I think about this in terms of identifying people at a young age and actively cultivating these skills and interests. I think one of the challenges that we sometimes have is that if we don't engender a real commitment to the medium, we lose some of the folks who should be writing opera. They end up writing musical theater or pop music or film scores. And I don't think that that's a bad thing for those individuals, but it is a bad thing for the form, right? So some of what I think about is how do we make more space in opera so that we can communicate to those people who have an interest in creating that this is a place where you can play around, you can create new things. As Nkeiru alluded to a little earlier, you can tell stories that are not just provocative or shocking. You can write comedies, you can write really small, intimate pieces, or you can talk about something really, really massive. But the most important thing is finding the individuals who are interested and who have some propensity to be able to communicate within the medium itself.
Mm. Mm.
Well, and Nkeiru, then how do you make these works relevant to today, to audiences today? Not only just you have to obviously when you're commissioned for a work, there's entertainment part of it that the part is entertainment, but you also want it to be relevant and empowering, as Lee was saying. How do you do that?
Wow. Well, I'm glad you asked. Now, of course, I have to come up with an answer.
I'm sure you have the answer.
Well, there are kind of two different scenarios. One is when a producer comes up to me and says, "Hi, we have a piece for XYZ occasion." Sometimes also they'll come up to me and say, "Okay, we want you to write a piece about this." And then I'm left with their story. And sometimes that can be counterintuitive to this goal that we have of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And the barrier is simply racism. You're thinking, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. They're already asking a Black woman to write an opera. What's racist? What's bias about that? Well, their perspective a lot of times, the bias is there. If they see Black people as socioeconomically disadvantaged, then it starts from there, and the seeds of what are going to happen in that story go downhill right from there. Now, because I have this situation happen, I've had people come up to me with, here's the story, and it's completely demeaning to African Americans and specifically to Black women. And they don't understand that when they come to me, that it is demeaning. And so sometimes I'll ask, is this a story that you'd want about your mother? Mm. And they think about it, or your sister. Okay, so why are you asking me this? So then we have some other, and I have some soft responses for that, which is, if you could flesh this out, or here's something about this that to me makes it seem less, something that I wouldn't want to work on, or here's a way that it would be more appealing to me. But if your goal is simply to have a story, I've got some stories. And so I had this list, and I love it when producers come up to me and say, what is it that you want to work on?
You talked about communities where had been denied, weren't invited for how many years. Now all of a sudden we want to invite. What are some of the tricks to going into these communities and saying, now trust us to come in, and we're finally inviting you after, 100 plus years where you weren't invited or welcome, perhaps?
I think the first thing is to kind of acknowledge that opera asks a lot of its audience, and probably a bit more than some other mediums. Sometimes you have to spend orders of magnitude more money either to create or experience opera. Opera can obligate its audience to spend a half day in a concert hall. And if you're talking about the ring cycle, then that may be your week. And then if you add to it that you're listening to a story that may not be immediately relevant to the time in which you live, or the language may be something that you don't understand, the takeaway for contemporary audiences is that this may be a form that is simply not for them, right? And there are a couple of places where I think we can really push back for the survival of the art form. I think the remedy to this assumes three things. One, that we've identified and started to address conceptual and practical barriers to participation, right? Why don't people go? Let's actually have some real conversations about how much it costs, how much time it takes, and where people are in their lives with stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Two, there need to be people of color represented broadly, as I brought out before, right? And I think that also extends to, we want to see queer stories on stage. We want to know that opera companies understand that women compose operas, women direct operas, women do lighting design, all of the above, right? And then three, traditional audiences of opera have to start feeling much more comfortable with the idea that we, people of color, also get to be in this space. We get to participate, we get to be represented. And I think it's really working on those three areas that sort of allows this to shift a little bit.
Usually I am that bridge figure because I'm a composer. Mm-hmm. And, I'll go into a community and people will tell me things that they will not tell the institution. And I just have that thing, because often, like with the case of Black Bottom, I'll just go around and say, hi, I'm writing a piece about this neighborhood. And the symphony asked me to come by and interview people. And they'll tell me things. And I'm just like, oh, really? Okay. But I take all of this information. If I'm writing about a place, like in that case, it was the Black Bottom area in Detroit that had been destroyed. As people were telling me the different stories about it, I would also ask them about their relationship with the institution. So as I do that with a very specific type of questionnaire, I can then go back to the institution and say, okay, this is the information that I've gotten, and P.S., here's why people aren't going, or this is what people think. And I also see from an institutional viewpoint, majority of outreach is geared at schools, but then for Black people, they assume that Black people are poor. So they'll go to schools in the poorest neighborhoods and then say, well, we did outreach and outreach didn't work. There needs to be the understanding of the way the community works. Now, with Black Bottom, which kind of is, well, I don't know. I mean, it's a sung story. It's got all these, has this community engagement built in. Some people who went will still swear they saw it in opera, which I think is very funny. But, I got people to see, well, what if we went to the middle class African Americans, because it's, you want it to be for this series, not just for any particular symphony, but often, when I'm called in, the thing is, okay, well, we're going to go into these schools in the inner city, and we're going to have this kind of a Cinderella story or this Pied Piper story, where suddenly they hear the music, and I'm saying, okay, have you any idea how incredibly patronizing that is? Yeah. Okay. So here's how the community work. If you go to the churches, if you go to the, in some cases, the mosques, if you go to well, actually the hair salon is absolutely the barbers. And yeah, see, these are places, you're smiling. These are places where people congregate. They don't care about your opera company going to, doing these things. It's already elitist. It's already turned them away. So you need to go to where they go and recognize that not all of them speak with a specific dialect, not all, and if you do that, it can start from there. Then you start having some board members, but it begins with just having this concept that people who look like me, people who look like you, people who look like you also, I'm sorry, you, Lee, and you, Arthur.
Yes.
Yeah, people, people who look like us have the same credentials as them. And as they realize this, they might realize that we also have money to spend, but you're going to have to get us to spend it. And if we're going to spend that money, we're less likely to spend it on something that you kind of have to go to. You want it to be something that you want to go to. So if you're going to be stared at, if you're experienced that you go into this hall and people are staring at you as if you don't belong, if it's already a hostile environment, if you go in and you see that there's a story about a Black person, or there's a story and the only Black person that you see is a janitor or a slave or doesn't have a name, you're not going to want to go back. I mean, would you want to go back? It's rather silly. So you want to see yourself represented on stage. You want to see yourself represented from the crew. You want to be able to go through the program and say, okay, besides the cast, there's also so-and-so, there's so-and-so. And these are goodwill gestures, but they make a big impact, a huge impact.
Wow. So I guess I'll go back to Lee then. If our art form embraces this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what do you think the landscape will look? Give us an idea what that actually looks like.
Sure. So I think to Nkeiru's point is that where we need to be thinking is about nuance, right? Nuance in our audiences, right? And there is as much nuance in audiences of color as there is in white audiences, right? And I think part of what we really need to think about is a couple of things. One, there are as many ways to be Black as there are people who are Black, and sort of being aware of the multiplicity of stories that we could tell to a multiplicity of people is really, really important. I think the other piece that we really need to make sure that we're engaging with is the idea that there is a way that we can be authentic about this, right? And that looks like having sustained engagements that are actually substantive, where we are listening to communities and are actually in conversation, right? Not just relaying information and not just sort of, carting people across town to come here in February and now 1 week in June, right? Really understanding that people are Black all year. I certainly am. And that my interest in the opera is something that I have all year, right? Can you cater to me as a potential ticket buyer from that standpoint? And I think opera companies have the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can think more broadly about audiences, and we can think more broadly about how we're reaching them. So instead of maybe just sitting with the idea that there are 4, 5, 6 pieces that we're going to present over the course of the year, what are the many ways that we can reach out to people and touch people and engage people and bring them into what we're doing throughout the year? How do we use social media? How do we use the internet? How do we use live performances? And then, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I do think it bears repeating. Who is delivering this message, right? Who works at our organizations? Which artists are we engaging on stage, and then which artists may we be engaging, in social media to deliver some of this? Really having an awareness of there are a lot of stories, many, many more of them need to be told, and having some faith in our existing audiences to know that if we're doing 3 of the 6 pieces that year happen to focus on stories about people of color that our white audiences aren't simply going to evaporate, right? The people who love opera, they can probably be given just a little bit more credit, right? And we can probably trust that they are going to continue to be engaged as long as we are putting up valuable art, right? So I think that that's some of what we can be doing on the institutional side.
Wonderful. Can I ask you this question, Nkeiru? As a young woman of color who has distinguished herself on the operatic stage, symphonic stage, what would you say to a young composer? I believe I read you wrote your first piece at age 13, I believe I read. What do you say? What advice might you give to a young composer out there today trying to think, should I try to go this way, or maybe hip hop or R&B should be my route?
Well, I think that if you want to write for the symphony, that's what you should do. I think that if you want to write for opera, that's what you should do. Now, also, one thing that I didn't know at that age is that I had lots and lots of good company. And I found out when I was in college, there were books like The Black Composer Speaks.
Oh, yes.
There are books that I'm in now, which I find to be absolutely hilarious and humbling and also totally awesome. There's this coloring book out, the Rachel Barton Pine coloring book of music, music of Black composers, and she just has them. And so, resources like this let you know, hey, I'm not by myself. It's going to take a lot of courage to go into that conservatory. You're going to face more racism. You're going to never be as aware of your race than when you are at that conservatory. And if you are fortunate enough to have a piece performed by any major symphony, you will be the only Black person possibly on the stage, possibly in the room, maybe one of 5 of a group of 100.
Wow.
Be ready, be prepared, be excellent, because you got this.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left. Were there any points that I didn't bring up or ask that you thought you wanted to mention? You could mention them now. Is there anything I didn't ask or something you really wanted to say?
I think we need to kind of piggybacking on one thing that Lee said. Opera should be for everyone. Opera should be for everyone. Now, opera should be for everyone. As long as we get that, as long as we see that, as long as we conceive that, there's not going to be the one piece that represents everybody. You're not going to have to take this one piece and make it into all the, make it fit all of your diversity needs. No, opera is for everybody. It means that the people who are in the seats, the people who are ushering, the people who are, some of the people who are behind stage, some of the people who are on stage, some of the people who are in your pit. Opera is for everybody.
And I would love to add that we should not run from innovation and reinvention. I think we really need to think about how we embrace that. Because if we are invested in having opera be here, not just for everyone, but also be here in the future for our grandkids, for instance, then I think we need to get a lot more comfortable with the ways that other media have stayed relevant is that they have harnessed technology and change to make themselves better. And there is much more space that we can give in classical music generally to the idea that there is change happening all around us, change in terms of the people who want to create, the people who want to listen, and then the stories that need to be told. And I think we have to embrace this.
Wow. Well, Nkeiru Okoye and Lee Bynum, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. We'll be watching with continued interest with your work in the coming days and months.
Thank you as well, Arthur.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been wonderful.